Every family has a ritual that no one questions, something that repeats itself, not because it's good, but because it's always been that way. In my family, it was Sunday dinner. The table was large, too large to hide the emptiness that existed between the people sitting there. The smell of food mingled with rehearsed conversations, automatic laughter, and that constant need to prove that everything was all right. I always arrived a few minutes late, not because of disorganization, but because deep down I knew my presence didn't change anything. When I sat down, the noise decreased for a moment. A short silence, almost imperceptible, but enough to make it clear that I was a strange element in that environment, like a piece that doesn't fit, but that no one has the courage to remove. I smiled. I always smiled. I learned early on that, in that family, silence and smiles were forms of survival. While they talked, I observed. While they laughed, I analyzed. While they praised each other, I remembered everything they never said about me, but always thought. Since I was little, I understood what my role was. Not the problem child, not the rebel. Worse, the disappointing one. The one who had potential but never quite fit in. The one who could have been more. The one who was always a step below. None of this was said aloud. It didn't need to be. Families don't hurt with shouting. They hurt with subtle comparisons, sideways glances, and strategic silences. That Sunday, something was different. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe it was the accumulated stress. Or maybe I was finally ready to hear what had always been said without words. The conversation revolved around the same old themes: achievements, money, plans, travel, repeated stories, told as if they were new. Everyone vying for attention, validation, recognition. I ate slowly, not out of politeness, but because that place never made me hungry. Then someone said something. They didn't raise their voice. They didn't show anger. They said it as if commenting on the weather. "You don't belong here." The phrase didn't echo. It sank. It sank too deep to provoke an immediate reaction. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. But it wasn't a silence of shock. It was a silence of agreement. Nobody corrected them. Nobody argued. Nobody thought it was exaggerated. Some looked away. Others continued chewing. There, I understood something that took me years to accept. When nobody defends you, the absence of words is also an answer. I felt something strange at that moment. It wasn't anger. It wasn't sadness. It was clarity, as if an ancient fog had dissipated. I smiled, and that smile confused everyone because they expected a reaction. They expected an explanation. They expected a justification, but I didn't owe them any. As the conversation slowly resumed, something inside me reorganized itself. It wasn't pain, it was reorganization. Like when an old structure finally collapses to make room for something new. I thought about all the times I tried to please, all the times I molded myself, all the times I swallowed words to avoid causing discomfort. And suddenly, a question arose with brutal clarity. Since when was I trying to belong to a place that needed to diminish me to feel whole? That smile wasn't weakness. It was acceptance, but not in the way they imagined. I accepted, for the first time, that the problem was never me. Dinner ended as always. Empty hugs. Automatic goodbyes. No one noticed that. That night, something had ended. They thought they had put me in my place. But without knowing it, they had done something much worse. They had set me free. Because when someone tells you that you don't belong, and you finally believe it, it doesn't hurt anymore. And that's exactly where everything starts to change. No one is born feeling out of place. That's learned. Learned little by little, in details so small that when you realize it, it's already become part of who you are. In my family, the learning started early. I was the child who heard phrases like, "Your cousin is more resourceful. Your brother has more of an knack for this." You just lack the attitude. There was always a "you just lack." That's the thing. It was never enough. When I got it right, it was an obligation. When I got it wrong, it was confirmation. I quickly learned that love there came conditionally, and that approval needed to be earned, but never completely. At family gatherings, I watched the children running, laughing, being celebrated for small achievements. A drawing, a good grade, a well-made joke. I did the same, but the feedback was different. A nod, a cool, a silence soon after. It wasn't explicit rejection, it was something worse, polite indifference. Over time, I started talking less, not out of shyness, but because I realized my words didn't change anything. When I spoke, they interrupted. When I was quiet, nobody asked. So I chose the safest path, that of functional invisibility, being present without taking up space, being seen without being noticed. In adolescence, this intensified. While others were encouraged to try, I was advised not to get my hopes up. While they made mistakes and received support, I made mistakes and received silence. And silence, when repeated, becomes a message. The message was clear. Don't expect too much. We already know how far you'll go. It was during this phase that I began to observe carefully. Not the people outside, but them. I started to notice who needed to be admired, those who lived for applause, those who maintained an image too fragile to be questioned. While everyone thought I was lost, I was attentive. I learned to listen to what wasn't said, to understand tensions hidden in jokes, to perceive insecurities disguised as authority. I didn't have a voice, but I had vision. And vision, over time, transforms into an advantage. Even so, there were attempts. I tried to please. I tried to fit in. I tried to be what they expected. I changed my behavior. I changed my plans. I changed my dreams. But the more I tried to fit in, the tighter the space became, because the problem was never my size. It was the mold. Little by little, I began to understand something uncomfortable. They needed me to be what went wrong. Families like that function better when someone carries the invisible weight, the role of the less, of the almost, from not quite there yet. That creates contrast. That feeds the egos of others. And I was playing that role perfectly until one day I stopped trying. It wasn't a dramatic act. There was no announcement. It was internal. I started conserving energy. I stopped explaining my plans. I stopped asking for validation. The less I spoke, the more they thought I was stagnant. and that reassured them. They liked seeing me still, because that way, nothing needed to change. But inside me, something was forming. A silent identity, not based on approval, but on autonomy. I didn't want to be seen anymore. I wanted to be prepared. And while they kept repeating old stories, I started writing something that no one there could read. Yet, there's a huge difference between staying silent and choosing silence. For a long time, I was silent because I didn't have space. Now, I was silent because I understood its value. When I stopped trying to explain who I was, something curious happened. People started projecting onto me what they needed. For some, I was the one who didn't succeed. For others, the one who needed help. For a few, the one who was a little lost. I let them believe it. Silence has this advantage. It doesn't commit to other people's narratives. While they talked too much, I observed. While they justified themselves, I mentally noted things down. I started to notice clear patterns. Who always needed to be heard first? Who changed moods when they weren't the center of attention? Who used criticism as a form of control? I was no longer hurt. I was lucid. Silence became a filter. I separated what was noise from what was truth. At dinners, I spoke less and less. And the less I spoke, the more comfortable they became. My silence validated their superiority. My withdrawal reinforced the narrative that I posed no threat to anyone, and that was exactly what I wanted. It was during this period that I also began to work in silence, without announcing it, without asking for opinions, without sharing plans. I discovered that when you talk too much about what you want to do, you waste energy trying to sustain other people's expectations. When you are silent, all the energy stays with you. I worked while they underestimated me. I learned while they gave their opinions. I grew while they repeated the same stories. And the most ironic thing, the more I progressed, the less desire I had to prove anything. Silence also taught me something uncomfortable. Not all distance is loss. Some distance is necessary so that you can breathe. I started to distance myself emotionally before I distanced myself physically. I was still present, but no longer involved. The comments that once hurt, now only confirmed them. Every joke, every comparison, every sharp remark served as a silent reminder. It's good that they don't know who you're becoming. They thought I was standing still, because silent growth makes no noise, and that creates a huge advantage. No one tries to stop something they don't believe exists. Over time, I even stopped wanting recognition, because recognition from those who only respect what they understand has little value. I was building something internal before any external result. Emotional autonomy, clarity, self-sufficiency. It wasn't anger that moved me. It was focus. And focus is born when you stop trying to belong. Deep down, I didn't want to sit at that table anymore. I just hadn't left yet. But the decision had already been made. I was just waiting for the right moment. There's a silent moment in the life of someone who has always been underestimated. A moment when the pain no longer screams, but clarity begins to speak. That's where I arrived. There was no explosion. There was no visible rupture. There was focus. while they continued living the way they always had, I began to live in a way that no one there would recognize, not because it was better, but because it was mine. I stopped seeking belonging. I stopped waiting for invitations. I stopped justifying choices. And when you do that, something changes in how the world responds. I started small, discreetly, without applause. I learned to organize my time, my resources, my mind. I learned to trust execution more than intention, more in consistency than motivation. I didn't talk about plans because I understood something simple. Plans that are shared too much become targets. Silent plans become reality. While they argued about who was right, I worked. While they competed for attention, I built a foundation. While they repeated old stories, I created something new. And for the first time, no one had an opinion about my life. That was liberating. I realized that much of the pain I felt for years didn't come from their words. It came from my expectation that one day they would see me differently. When that expectation died, freedom was born. I started making choices that previously seemed wrong in their eyes. Choices that didn't give immediate status. That didn't make for nice dinner stories. But they yielded something much rarer, in inner peace. I began to respect my own limits, to say no without guilt, to leave without explaining. And something curious happened. The stronger I became inside, the less need I felt to prove anything on the outside. The desire for recognition was replaced by something more solid. Autonomy. They kept talking about me. I knew it. But now they spoke from a distance. Because when you stop reacting, people lose control over the narrative. I didn't confront. I didn't correct. I didn't explain. Silence again. But now, a sovereign silence. I began to notice that some of them were bothered, not by what I said, because I said nothing, but by what I no longer needed. They realized I was no longer seeking approval. And that breaks invisible structures. Families based on emotional hierarchy don't cope well with someone who simply withdraws from the game. But I wasn't playing anymore. I was living. And for the first time, I felt something I had never felt in that house. Silent pride in myself. Not for grand achievements, but for having survived the constant attempt to diminish me. Without becoming bitter, the freedom I was building wasn't external. It was internal. And when that settles in, everything else follows. I still showed up occasionally. I still sat at the table sometimes. But something was different. I no longer belonged there. And I was finally at peace with that. I hadn't planned on returning, not because I was afraid, but because I no longer needed to. Still, I accepted the invitation, not out of longing, not out of obligation, but out of closure. The dinner seemed the same house, the same table, the same faces, but the atmosphere was different. When I entered, I noticed something immediately. The silence wasn't uncomfortable like before. It was attentive. They observed me in a new way, like someone trying to recognize someone who has changed, but doesn't know exactly what has changed. I sat in the same place as always, but I didn't feel small. The conversation began with banalities. Weather, work, repeated news. Only now there were pauses. Small interruptions. Glances that met. I answered little. Not strategically. Out of lack of need. There was nothing left there that I needed to defend. Over time, the questions began, questions disguised as interest. And you, what have you been doing? What are you working on now? Where are you living now? Questions that never came before. I answered with short sentences. No exaggeration, no mystery. And that bothered them more than any provocation. They expected justifications, long explanations, perhaps even requests for approval. But I offered none of that. I noticed exchanged glances, attempts to read me. They wanted to understand if I was better or worse, because for them, only those two options existed. No one considered the possibility of me being at peace. At a certain point, someone tried to soften the past. Sometimes we say things without realizing it. It wasn't an apology, it was a rehearsal. I didn't respond, not out of resentment, but because some conversations only exist to ease the conscience of the speaker, not to repair the damage done to the listener. Dinner continued, but something was clear. The dynamic had changed. They no longer talked about me. They talked around me as if I had ceased to be predictable. And that creates discomfort. Before, I occupied a defined role. Now, I was an enigma. And families that live by labels don't deal well with enigmas. As the night drew to a close, someone said, "I think we misjudged you." The phrase hung in the air. In the past, that would have meant everything to me. Today, it meant almost nothing. Not because I was being dishonest, but because it was too late. I just nodded, without emotion, without pride. That dinner wasn't a reunion. It was a realization. I no longer belonged there, but for the first time, it didn't hurt. When I said goodbye, I felt something curious. No urgency to return. No need to maintain a presence. They stayed. I left. And this time, I took nothing with me. There's a difference between leaving and disappearing. I didn't announce my absence. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't explain my reasons. I simply stopped going. At first, nobody noticed. A week? 2? A month. My absence didn't cause immediate alarm because, for a long time, my presence was never central. I was always the detail, not the focus. But absence is different. It creates a space that can't be easily filled. Little by little, they started to notice. First as a slight annoyance, then as strangeness. Someone commented that it had been a while since I'd shown up. Another said I must have been busy. Nobody asked directly, because asking would require acknowledging that something had changed, and changes scare those who live by repetition. Meanwhile, I continued my life, without looking back, without monitoring reactions. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to them. They were reacting to my absence, and that reverses everything. Families accustomed to exercising emotional control don't know how to deal with someone who simply withdraws. There's no confrontation, no direct conflict, only emptiness. The place at the table remained empty, and nobody sat there, not out of respect, but out of discomfort, because that space reminded them of something nobody wanted to face, the way they treated me. Absence exposes what presence camouflages. Without me, there to fulfill the role of less, the contrasts began to disappear. And when the contrast disappears, insecurities appear. Small conflicts arose between them. Comparisons changed their target. Tensions became more visible. I was no longer the invisible buffer. and that bothered them. At some point, someone tried to contact me. A short message, too neutral to be longing, too polite to feel regret. I responded cordially, without an invitation, without an opening, because returning unnecessarily is the same as asking permission to exist, and I no longer asked for anything. Over time, the invitation ceased, not out of indifference, but because they realized I wouldn't return to my old role. The absence wasn't temporary. It was structural, and that requires reorganization, something few families are willing to do. I didn't feel guilt, nor anger. I felt something rarer, coherence. My life began to flow without that invisible weight, without the need to prove my worth, to justify my choices, to explain myself. I breathed better. And while they dealt with the empty space I left, I occupied new spaces, chosen, not imposed. The absence wasn't punishment. It was a consequence, and consequences teach more than confrontations. Over time, the phrase lost the weight it once had. You don't belong here. It no longer hurt. It no longer provoked a reaction. It no longer demanded a response, because I finally understood something simple and definitive. Belonging was never about physical space. It was never about sitting at the table. It was never about blood ties. Belonging is about being able to exist without diminishing oneself. And in that place, that was never possible. For a long time, I thought the problem was mine, that I needed to change, improve, prove myself, that if I tried hard enough, if I was patient, if I was understanding, one day I would be accepted. But acceptance that demands self-annihilation is not acceptance, it's control. And control disguised as family hurts more than open rejection. Today, looking back, I realized that the separation wasn't a loss. It was a course correction. I didn't abandon anyone. I chose myself. And this choice wasn't accompanied by euphoria. It was accompanied by silence, by a strange peace at first, almost uncomfortable, because those who have lived in constant tension take time to trust in tranquility. But, little by little, this peace took hold. I began to build relationships where I didn't need to perform, where I didn't need to justify decisions, where I didn't need to be less so that others would feel more. I discovered that real belonging doesn't exact an emotional toll. It welcomes. Sometimes I think of them, not with resentment, nor with longing. I think of them with distance. I understand today that many people hurt, not out of malice, but out of incapacity, inability to deal with difference, inability to accept those who don't follow the expected script. This explains, but doesn't justify. The most important thing is that I stopped trying to be understood by those who never wanted to listen, and that changed everything. If one day someone at that table realized what happened, I don't know, but I know there was a moment when the dynamic broke down, when the role they gave me became empty, and when a system loses a silent piece, it needs to reorganize itself. I moved on. I moved on quietly, without speeches, without flaunting victories, because the greatest victory wasn't being recognized. It was no longer needing that. Today, if someone told me again that I don't belong, I would agree, but with relief, because there are places where not belonging is a sign of lucidity. And sometimes the strongest gesture someone can make isn't to stay and fight. It's to leave silently and live better.